In this video, we're going to talk about the Fujifilm X system and how to get you started in filmmaking, vlogging, or in general, how to use the Fujifilm system when you want to film. It's going to be a beginner tutorial, so we're going to touch on every single important settings and how to get you started. Guys, welcome back. Good to see you. Every single new subscriber. Fantastic to have you here on the channel as well. I'm Florian. So guys, as mentioned already, today we're going to touch on the subject how to get started with Fujifilm for filming, content creation towards filming, vlogging, or anything similar. We're also going to touch on what sort of lenses you might want to consider when you want to film with the Fujifilm X system, and also what sort of SD cards you need or any sort of accessories. So without further saying, let's dive into it. Okay, let's jump into the menu. Let's go with our first setting. We need to decide what we're going to do, and this is going to be our movie mode. Our movie mode, we need to decide if we want to shoot 4K, Full HD or DCI. 4K resolution is obvious, is 4K resolution, so you get the best quality out of the Fujifilm system. Full HD is a lower resolution, so if we want to get the best quality out of it, we're going with 4K 16:9 as a format. Then we got a bunch of different frame rates as well, such as like 24, 25, 29, 97, 50, 59, 94. So a bunch of different frame rates. Let's say you wanted to shoot a YouTube video, one head talking short, or even like this tutorial right now, you're probably good off with 24 or 25 frames per second. If you would shoot an interview, you probably want to consider shooting 25 to 30 frames per second. And if you would shoot anything sport related where you want to get rid of a motion blur a bit, then probably 50 or 60 frames per second are a good option to shoot with. Coming over to our megabytes, 200 megabytes on average is more than enough resolution and information and file size you need when it comes down to your filmmaking. On average, I record 200 megabytes with Fujifilm, and I never had any issues to edit any sort of videos I had, or had the feeling that I didn't have enough information within my videos. So coming out after we decided our movie mode, we're coming down to our format. What sort of format we want to record? Is it H.265 or H.264? The difference is the color information we're going to record. H.265 is the higher color information. We're going to record 420 10-bit internally to the SD card, and with the H.264 we're going to record 8-bit 420 color information. If you want to get the best possible quality out of your camera, you choose H.265 and record 10-bit 420 color information. Let's say you would do a lot of run and gun shoot and you have a high turnaround and it's purely done for social media, your content. You also can go with H.264 8-bit 420 color information. The difference between both of those files is the color information you record. With the 10-bit you got a bit more flexibility later in post to color grade your footage. With the 8-bit you can do it a bit less, but personally speaking, either way, if you record 8-bit or 10-bit, if you upload it to social media, both will do just fine. On average, I record H.265 to get the most information and best possible quality out of my system. With the movie compression, I leave it to long GOP, and my computer never had any issues to process the information either. Then full high-speed recording, here's where the YouTube 120 frames per second cinematic magic is happen. So you could record with the Fujifilm system either 120 frames per second slow motion or even 240 frames per second slow motion with the Fujifilm X-T4. And then you can choose what sort of frame rate you would like to record your 120 frames per second. Let's say you would have a timeline later when editing your video of 24 frames per second. Then I personally shoot 5 times 24 frames per second to reach my 120 frames per second slow motion. So then we're coming down to the F-Log and HLG recording. Now we need to decide, because we said it's a beginner tutorial, we need to make sure that our recording or film simulation is set to film simulation. So if we're coming back in F-Log HLG recording, we need to make sure that it's set to those film simulation signs, that we basically can choose our film simulation we want to record within camera. Coming up to our film simulation, because we decided to record film simulation, we could use any single film simulation which Fujifilm offers to use. The majority of Fujifilm recommends to use the Eterna Cinema film simulation to record your videos, which is a nice overall film simulation, and it's probably the best beginning point for your filming. You could, as an example, also use Acros if you wanted to shoot a black and white video. However, keeping in mind, if you use one of those black and white film simulation, you can't undo this later in post and your video will be black and white. If you wanted to swap it or change your video from color into black and white, always record the color simulation and then convert it into black and white when you're doing video work. So because we said we chosen Eterna as a starting point with our film simulation, we are also able to adjust the color profile within camera. So this means basically we could change our highlight tones, our shadow tones, color, sharpness, noise reduction. Everything what you could do in post, you can also do in camera if you wanted to. I personally, if I shoot Eterna, I just bump my shadow tone to -2 or turn my shadow tone down to -2 and bump up the shadows a bit in camera, and then I do everything else in post later. But that's purely down to you if you want to change those settings, if you want to try to have everything ready in camera, or you say, okay, I just do everything later in post. Then also one very important setting is a white balance. White balance, there are a few options. You can use presets from Fujifilm or within a camera, such as like daylight, shade, or your auto white balance. The thing you don't want, and this I think is very important, you don't want the shifting white balance between your clips. Set your white balance to daylight or sunlight and have a consistent white balance. Or even set a Kelvin by yourself. 5600 Kelvin is around daylight temperature. If you need to change your daylight or the temperature of a white balance, you can do this in post later. But it's definitely better to have a set white balance than before every single clip the white balance is different or things changing. Some of the clips are warmer, some of the clips are colder. It will make your life harder when you decide to edit your shots or you do the after post-processing and you need to change every single clip the white balance. So definitely recommended to set your white balance to a set white balance, that the white balance doesn't shift all the time. Then also depends on your ISO, your dynamic range. Let's say you would shoot an ISO of 160 or 200. You have a dynamic range of 100. This dynamic range will reach up to 320 ISO. From 320 ISO up to 640 ISO, your dynamic range is 200. And everything above your ISO of 640, your dynamic range is set to 400. On average, if you got a nice sunny day, you shoot Eterna. Let's say your ISO is set to 200 to the lowest with the Fujifilm X-T3. Then your dynamic range of 100 is probably enough to get a nice looking image. Just make sure that your footage is perfectly exposed and you will have a nice looking image. Then we're coming over to movie AF mode. This basically will clarify if you got your little dot or focus square in the middle of your screen, or if you choose to have multi and use a whole screen as a focus area. I do use both. It really depends what I'm gonna do. If I say I vlog, then I use a whole screen because my screen is in front of my face. but also I'm gonna use eye and face detection as well, which I'm gonna throw in. Here we go, eye and face detection, doesn't want Q button, and my eye and face detection is switched on as well. So really depends what you shoot. If I shoot slow motion, 120 frames per second, and I focus on one single subject in front of me, then probably I would use the area where I got the square and can put it onto the subject. If I shoot anything in front of a camera, such as myself, then I use multi, or I would just hold a hand in front of it, I use multi as well. Face and eye detection we covered with the same movie AF mode right now. Autofocus custom settings, you can tweak your autofocus settings a bit and say your tracking sensitivity is a bit faster and your autofocus speed is a bit faster or slower. It really depends on what you've tried to film. I bumped both of them up. My tracking sensitivity is +2 and my autofocus speed is +2 with the X-T3. Personally, this works just fine for me, and the majority of times I'm doing head talking shots where I don't need the too fast autofocus anyway, so absolutely fine for myself. Another important setting is definitely the zebra setting, which will indicate when you over or underexpose something. I got my zebra setting set to left, that's personal preference. You can have it also from a right side coming in. I got it from a left side. And then my zebra settings are set to 75%. It works for my personal needs, and I found this a good sweet spot where it doesn't clip too far, or it doesn't indicate that I clipped something too far, and it doesn't indicate it too slow either. And then basically the last one will be your audio settings. With the audio settings, we definitely want to avoid to use the internal microphone. So I got mine set to manual, ±0 decibels. Always have an external microphone I plug in, and then I need to set it, or I do set it to manual and set my decibels accordingly to my microphone. Every microphone is slightly different. Every microphone sensitivity is slightly different as well. Some microphones are more sensitive, so you need to turn the decibels a bit down. Other microphones are less sensitive, such as like this one, this little Boya shotgun mic. So you need to set the decibels maybe a bit higher. So this is something you need to try out. This purely comes down to what sort of microphone you use and how sensitive this microphone will be. And then you need to set your audio levels accordingly to this. Mic level, wind filter, low cut filter are all off. Don't bother about them too much. You're better off using a dead cut than those settings within camera. Okay, let's do a little recap here regarding settings and what sort of settings are important. When I'm shooting, I'm using 4K 16:9, which is your average and most common format when filming. 24 frames per second for all my head talking shots, or even just for anything where I need this motion blur in it in filming, or anything normal, natural looking footage where I want this motion blur, then I shoot 24 frames per second. And my megabytes are 200 megabytes per second. Plenty of resolution, plenty of information within your files, gives you the best overall or a decent overall file size as well. Then my recording format is set to H.265 10-bit 420 color information to get the best possible quality and most information of color into my footage as well. Then I got my face and eye detection on average on as well, or at least my face detection, just to make sure the camera focuses on my face. Color profile, if you shoot color profile, then shoot Eterna at 200 ISO, dynamic range of 100, and your shutter speed of 48th of a second at 24 frames per second. Very important, make sure you follow the 180-degree shutter rule and double up your shutter speed to your frame rate to get the most natural looking footage. As mentioned, this motion blur is shot at 24 frames per second and a shutter speed of at least 48th or 50th of a second. If you're struggling on a normal day to keep the 180-degree rule or the 180-degree shutter rule, you definitely need one of those, a variable ND filter that you can darken the amount of light which will hit the sensor. Definitely highly recommended, making sure you have a variable ND filter that you can keep your 180-degree rule. I know that a couple of YouTubers just bumping up the shutter speed because they don't want to carry around one of those variable ND filters. However, to get the best looking footage, to get the most natural motion blur, it's definitely, there's no way around without a variable ND filter or ND filter to make sure that you hold your 180-degree rule or shutter degree rule to make sure it looks most natural as possible. And then last but not least, as mentioned already, your audio. This really depends on what sort of microphone you're gonna plug in. And if you want to have a decent audio, there's no way around. You need to use an external microphone to get the best possible quality on audio out of your camera. And there are two more things we probably should talk about. The first thing is definitely the SD cards you might want to consider to use. I personally use a SanDisk Extreme Pro UHS 1 SD card, 64 gigs and 128 gigs, and I never did really run out of storage. It really depends on how much B-roll or in general how much you film. The UHS 1 SD cards lets you record up to 200 megabytes, and as I mentioned already earlier in this video, 200 megabytes are on average more than of plenty of resolution or information within your file. And then last but not least, the most common question, prime versus zoom, zoom versus prime. What's the right lens? What is the wrong lens? There is no right, there is no wrong. You need to decide if you're a prime shooter or a zoom shooter. However, if you're just starting out, you bought maybe your first Fujifilm camera, then definitely the 18-55 f2.824 OIS is definitely a good starting point for filming. You got a nice wide aperture of f2.8 at the widest at 18mm, and a lot of videos I shot on this lens and I never had really any issues with it, or I couldn't hold focus. So definitely the 18-55 is a very decent lens. Even for filmmaking, I found the autofocus fairly fast with it as well. An 18mm, or in full frame terms around 27mm. There's an argumentation point. Some people say it is too tight, some people say it is right. It's fine for vlogging or filmmaking. I personally say sometimes I found it alright and I found the framing okay. Other days I say 18mm is too tight and I would like to have it a bit wider. But as a starting point, 18-55 is definitely a good lens to start with. Having a prime lens like a 23mm f2, I found this lens very good for portrait videos or anything where I got control over the camera. 23mm is definitely too tight for vlogging, but on average having a little prime lens without image stabilization, and you use as an example the Fujifilm X-T4 with IBIS built in, you get nice footage out of this lens. Right now if you have a person in front of you, the aperture of f2 gives you a nice blurry background as well. So overall, in generally speaking, if you're just starting out, you're looking for the all-around lens, the 18-55 is definitely a good purchase. Having a little prime lens, such as like the 23mm f2, for any sort of content creation where you standing behind the camera and you got control over the distance to your subject, is definitely a good purchase as well. Or even like the 10-24 f4 I'm currently using to film this video is a good lens as well. However, there are two downsides to it. It's a f4 which limits sometimes the amount of light the sensor gets, and you need to bump up the ISO too high in my personal opinion. And also because it is a wide angle lens, you get those wobbles sometimes in the corner which are very obvious. So overall, get the 18-55. I would suggest it's a good starting point to get you started within a Fujifilm system for video. And with that said, guys, I hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, hit the thumbs up button. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you started, what you use, what sort of lens you use for filming. And with that said, guys, like, comment and subscribe. I'm gonna see you, my friend, very soon in another video. Cheers, guys.